I'm Dr. Barry, licensed psychologist, and today we're going to hop right into the testimony of two forensic psychologists on day 15 of the Letecia Stauch trial. And I'm recording this on Thursday, April 27th. The full video will be linked down below. I'm just covering key moments and then just explaining a little bit more. There is a lot of confusion when it comes to mental health, and here on my channel, I want to help dismantle mental health stigma. We're going to start out with Dr. Jackie Grimmett. She is a forensic psychologist and she is a board certified forensic psychologist. And they went into the difference between clinical and forensic, and she did a second opinion for the competency evaluation. She was actually requested by Letecia's first lawyer, and she doesn't have any stake. So like she gets paid the same whether she's finds somebody competent or whether they are incompetent. And she works with both the defense and the prosecution to gather all the information needed to be able to proceed. They also clarified that she would not be able to render an opinion regarding sanity because she did not assess that. She only assessed competency to stand trial. Insanity at the time of the offense, the second expert is going to talk about that a little bit more. She did not finish her testimony on Wednesday and will be following up with more testimony tomorrow, which I'll cover in a separate video.
There's been reference to the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual that I think everyone knows that psychologists and psychiatrists use to evaluate people. Within that manual, would you find competency?
No.
Is that a medical diagnosis?
No.
Is that a legal term?
Yes.
What about insanity?
Same.
Legal term?
Legal term.
It's not in the DSM-5.
No.
So how do you go about determining whether or not someone's competent to proceed? What do you look for? Kind of run the jury through that process.
So the statute outlines what a competency to proceed evaluation entails. The requirements are that the defendant needs to have the ability to have a factual and rational understanding of the proceedings, and also to have an ability to consult with their attorney to assist in their defense. So in pursuit of that, I would conduct a clinical interview, look at their current mental status, ask them very specific questions about the legal process and their case in order to establish whether or not they had that understanding and ability, and if not, why not? And that why not has to relate to a mental illness.
And so why is it that you need to look at the police reports and the discovery in a criminal case in conjunction with talking to whoever's being evaluated?
So in order to assess whether the defendant has a rational and factual understanding of the proceedings, that includes their case, I have to understand their case well enough to know whether or not they understand their case.
And so prior, I'm assuming you eventually sat down with Ms. Stauch and had a forensic interview with her?
Yes.
Prior to that, did you review the materials in this case, the police reports and so forth?
Yes.
Did you have any concerns about Mrs. Stauch's credibility going into that forensic interview?
Credibility is always something to consider in a criminal case. There's always high stakes, especially in a case like this. There seemed to be a lot of inconsistencies in the records that I was reviewing that made me question what kind of presentation she was going to have when I met with her.
And I should have asked you this before, but do you recall when you got the court order to do the evaluation?
She does not.
I know it's in my report. The date of the orders in my report, I don't know off the top of my head.
And her testimony was really good.
If your report was filed on January 7th of 2021, obviously it would have been sometime before that.
Yes, I met with Ms. Stauch in December 2020. So the order would have come in probably a month or two before that.
Okay, that's fine. So you said you met with Ms. Stauch on December of 2020. Do you see Ms. Stauch in the courtroom today? Could you please point her out and describe what she's wearing?
She's sitting in between two attorneys with teal.
Okay. May the record reflect identification of the defendant subject to cross-examination.
The record will so reflect. Go ahead.
How long did you meet with Ms. Stauch?
I met with her for about 3 hours and 40 minutes.
And did you meet with her one time or on different times?
I met with her once.
And Could you just give, I know it's a long process of the forensic interview, but could you give the jury a little idea of how the interview started and what your first impressions were of Ms. Stauch when you started the forensic interview?
So whenever I sit down with a defendant, I give them a notification of purpose. Because it's a court-ordered evaluation, they don't really have the ability to not participate. They can choose not to participate. I still have to do an evaluation of that person. So I explain that there's no confidentiality, that I'm not there to help them. I'm here to help the court. What's going to happen with the report that I get, those kind of things. And then I check to make sure that she understood what I had to say, and she understood the context of our meeting, and she indicated that she did. She made some complaints, I believe, about her attorneys and feeling it was a conspiracy, but understood what we were doing. And then I proceeded to ask her background questions, trying to establish what her social and mental health history had been in order to give some context to the current day. And that took a long time. Ms. Stauch is very verbose and likes to expound on her answers. So the interview took a long time. And then I had some concerns based on the prior testing from the original evaluation, where she produced invalid results on some tests, and the inconsistencies that I was seeing both in the records and in meeting with her, that I administered some tests to assess for the genuineness of her responding. And then I proceeded with the legal questions at the end.
Based on your history in this profession, I would imagine that you've seen people with some serious mental illness. We talked about the post-traumatic stress disorders that our soldiers have when they come back from Afghanistan and things like that. Did you note any of that on your initial impression of Ms. Stauch?
Did I note what specifically?
Whether or not she had a severe mental illness based on your initial conversation?
No, I did not believe she had a severe mental illness.
Had you seen that in your past where you're treating someone and the moment you see them, you know something's off? For instance, you might be experiencing some.
I've seen it from the lobby. So I've seen just from somebody coming in the door, I was like, ooh, okay, this person's going to need additional breaks. They are currently in a different state. I made reference to it within the report that some of the results might be inconsistent because the person was in such an emotional state. Or during testing, I've also seen things come up or somebody's mental health kind of deteriorate right in front of me in the middle of testing as well, or as they're going through their history. And so when somebody is presenting with a serious mental illness where it is impacting their daily functioning, their daily life, it's more than just causing sleep difficulties. Like, it is significantly impacting their day. It is very clear. And it was interesting to me that none of the psychologists that have come forward so far, none of them saw that. So we'll keep going.
Some sort of psychosis or things like that.
Yes, sometimes it's very obvious from the get-go, and sometimes it takes some time.
Did you give the jury an example of something that you've seen in your past where right away you knew there was some psychosis going on?
Sometimes as soon as somebody steps into the room, they're already having a conversation that you're not part of. And you try to interrupt them and orient them to what is happening, and it's as if you're not there. And the things that they're talking about are not apparently real. Conspiracies, people following them, all kinds of things.
Did you see anything like that with Ms. Stauch when you initially started talking to her?
She engaged in some behaviors. I think I mentioned in my report that she was humming to herself. She was putting her head on the wall. Her affect, which is what her expression of emotion, didn't really seem to fit what was happening. She seemed happier than she should have been. And she, at some point, turned around to talk to somebody else and then turned around to tell me what was happening.
What was that all about?
She said that she was talking to a vampire.
This vampire thing was weird.
And then resumed conversation with me.
We're going to talk about the vampires later in your testimony. Earlier, you indicated that you had some concerns about some prior psychological testing with regards to your interview with Ms. Stauch. Could you expand on that? What did you mean, and what were these psychological testing that you had concerns with?
So the previous evaluators had administered an MMPI and a PAI. I can say what those are if you need them for the record.
Sure. Why don't we talk about that? 'Cause first, we're hearing about it.
The MMPI is a Minnesota multiphasic personality interview.
Very long.
I think they gave version 2 or 2 revised format, I'm not sure. And the PAI is a personality assessment inventory. So those are long kind of forced choice self-report measures to look for psychopathology, any mental illness symptoms that people are experiencing. And you can answer them in such a way, there's what we call validity scales, which assess how genuinely you're responding. And you can answer in such a way that the protocols are not interpretable because it appeared somebody was trying to make themselves look worse than they were, or they were answering in a way that most people don't answer. And that's what happened with Ms. Stauch.
And do you recall reading is there a computer printout that's associated with the answers that Ms. Stauch gave, talking about various scales and whether or not she's feigning psychological symptoms, that kind of
thing? Yeah, you can get a computer printout of the results, yes.
And do you recall what the printout said with regards to the MMPI-2 that Ms. Stauch did with the prior evaluators?
I just remember it was uninterpretable because it was invalid responding.
Do you know whether or not she, based on the psychological testing, and was it Dr. Torres and Dr. Gray that did the prior competency evaluation?
So Dr. Torres and Dr. Gray did the prior competency evaluation. They had a
Torres
colleague,
can
Dr.
testify
Hashimoto,
next.
actually administer the tests.
And is that the test that you looked at prior to your interview?
Yes.
Did the results of that test indicate that her symptoms were the equivalent of someone who should have been in a psychiatric hospital? Various psychiatric issues?
I don't recall that it said that specifically. Typically, when a protocol is uninterpretable, I don't delve too much more into that because the information you get is not good information you can rely on.
Okay. Well, we'll ask Dr. Torres about that. You indicated that you reviewed materials prior to this interview. Did you review the notes from the mental health staff at the jail?
And I'm so sorry. He keeps moving away from the mic. So the sound is going to go up and down on here, but that's why he keeps moving away from the mic.
Regarding Ms. Stauch prior to your interview with her?
Yes.
Let's talk about those for a moment. Why did you review those notes?
Just good information.
When you're doing a competency evaluation, you just get a snapshot in time of somebody. You know, I met with Ms. Stauch for 3 hours and 40 minutes. But she may function differently outside of that environment. So I'm looking for information on how she does in general, not just considering my observations. People that have more contact with her might have different impressions, and those are important.
What was your impression of the notes as chronologically it led up to the point where you're doing a competency evaluation, starting from the moment she went into the jail on March 5th, 2020, up until December 2020 when you're interviewed?
They typically indicated that Ms. Stauch was complaining of anxiety and nightmares when she was receiving medications for those. I think from memory, she received those medications fairly quickly. And then in May, she had requested to come off of one of them because she didn't want to take it anymore, and the jail staff accommodated that. So she was taking one anti-anxiety medication when I met with her, which was Buspar. She had consistently been observed to not have serious symptoms of mental illness. There were quite frequent reviews of whether or not she was having hallucinations, complaining of hallucinations, suicidal, homicidal thoughts, those kind of things. She was consistently described as not experiencing any psychotic symptoms like that, although she had filed kites that were rather incoherent, didn't make sense, and the staff had noted that her behavior didn't match the kites.
Was there anything in the jail notes that led you to believe that perhaps she may have had a serious mental illness prior to your interview with her in December of 2020?
In the jail notes specifically? No, I think when she came into the jail, she didn't report any mental health history. And as her stay progressed, she started making comments about having been diagnosed with bipolar.
So I think for the rest of the day, she's pretty much going to keep, you can see Letecia in the back. She has her head down and she's pretty much going to keep her head down for most of this testimony. And I don't know if this is her trying to control her reactions, because she has been admonished by the judge at least once for her reactions to certain testimony. I think she was like flipping off a witness or something. But yeah, I made note of that.
Disorder, PTSD, and multiple personality disorder, as she called it, but that didn't feature until November.
And was that after she had raised competency in this case?
Yes.
I'm going to object to the term that Ms. Stauch raised competency. That was raised by her prior attorneys.
It was a good objection.
Overruled.
Did you also review Ms. Stauch's jail calls, or at least some of her jail calls that she had with various people while she was incarcerated?
I did.
And why did you review the jail calls?
It allows me to extend my observations of her in a somewhat more natural context, where she's not interfacing with a mental health professional, but she's talking to people that she knows. And the whole point of reviewing all these different sources of information is looking for consistency. If someone is impacted by something, you would expect them to be consistently impacted by that, not dependent on the context. So that's the purpose of reviewing those things.
I want to come back to the vampires now that we're talking about the jail calls. Did you know about Ms. Stauch's conversations about vampires based on the jail?
So this vampire part gets very odd, and this is the first time I've heard of it. And later she's going to talk about the diagnoses of borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder, or those features of those two disorders. And I've been saying the whole time that I was seeing cluster B personality traits. And the cluster B personality disorders are borderline, narcissistic, antisocial, and histrionic. If y'all have questions about any of this, please let me know. Some of this can get confusing, and it is my goal to just provide general education. And I can also point you to resources and tools of legit, good sources too, if anybody needs any sources or resources. But we'll keep going.
Calls that you listened to prior to meeting her in December 2020?
There was not a lot of content in the jail calls. I believe maybe one or two contained some statements, but not to the degree that she discussed with me.
What did you find relevant about the jail calls that you listened to?
There was between who she was talking to and what she was saying. She was talking to people and saying illogical things, saying that she wasn't doing well, losing her mind, those kind of things. And then consecutively calling her daughter and giving her very clear instructions on how to manage bank accounts, job interviews, what can you get for me, very clear, coherent requests that didn't make sense.
And were these phone calls?
And I also thought it was interesting. So I did a video on Harley's testimony. I thought it was interesting that from jail, she's calling Harley, requesting things from her. Like, that's just, ugh.
You said consecutively. Are they literally back to back? One moment she's talking crazy to someone, next moment she's talking to Harley, her daughter, and having a normal conversation?
Certainly on the same day.
And someone's mental health can change, but it's just.
Earlier, you testified that in a competency evaluation, you look at the statute and you make a determination of where you're going to go within that statute, I take it? That's a bad question. I'm going to rephrase it. Going into the competency evaluation, are you looking to diagnose her with a mental illness?
It's required for a competency evaluation to include a diagnosis. I don't go into a competency evaluation to diagnose someone. Some people don't have diagnoses, but I'm simultaneously looking at their competency-related abilities and whether or not they're experiencing any mental health symptoms, and formulating as I go along whether or not there's a barrier to them being able to meet the requirements to proceed.
Are you essentially gathering facts, looking at those facts, and weighing those facts to what the law is with regards to competency, and then rendering opinion back to the court?
Yes.
Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, that's much more succinctly than I said it.
I love her accent.
So during this interview, what are you looking for when you're talking to her? And why do you not rely on everything she's telling you with regards to vampires and other things that we're going to talk about?
For the reasons I mentioned, it's a forensic evaluation. There's often motivation to present yourself a certain way to achieve a certain outcome. So I'm trying to weigh what her experience is, what others have experienced with her. My goal is always, is there a barrier to competency? That's really all I'm looking for. Can you do this? If not, why not?
And earlier you mentioned some things that were mentioned in the jail notes, but did Ms. Stauch tell you what she felt her mental illnesses were?
I don't, well, she mentioned bipolar disorder to me. She did not ever say to me, I have dissociative identity disorder. And she told me briefly about some trauma she'd experienced, but I don't remember her explicitly stating I have PTSD.
Let's talk about the bipolar disorder first. Did you do anything to either diagnose her with that or rule it out, or what'd you do with the bipolar disorder information?
So I noticed from the first competency evaluation, they offered a rule out diagnosis of bipolar disorder, which means that there's not enough information to say yes or no. So I considered that in meeting with her, and bipolar disorder was something she mentioned in the jail record, and it's something she mentioned to me. As part of all competency evaluations, I go through many different symptoms of disorders to see what somebody might be.
So sometimes individuals with borderline personality disorder, their emotional ups and downs and getting really angry and switching really fast, but it is triggered by an event, versus versus bipolar disorder. The mania, it's not necessarily triggered by something specific. It is a chemical thing, and it just happens. And so sometimes people with borderline personality disorder get misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder. A person can have both. So you can have both diagnoses, but they were not seeing or hearing clear signs of manic behavior, which is required for a bipolar diagnosis.
Experiencing that they don't know is a mental illness. She said she was bipolar and described being impulsive all her life and being hyper, having mania, as she called it, for like a few minutes to a few hours. And those are not consistent with a bipolar illness.
Needless to say, you didn't diagnose her with bipolar disorder?
Excuse me. So the first evaluators offered a rule out, and in my evaluation, I ruled it out, saying I did not believe she had that.
You mentioned dissociative identity disorder. How did that come up in your conversation with Ms. Stauch?
She mentioned two instances whereby she asserted that she had found herself in places that she hadn't planned on being. And she also told me that she had various different personalities, and she named them for me.
Let's talk about the personalities first. What personalities did she name to you that she had?
She named Taylor, Isha, Jasmine, and I believe Jasper.
Okay.
It is interesting. I believe this expert and the next one is going to go into this more, but the way that Letecia described dissociative identity disorder, or the formation of these personalities, it's the way that a narcissist might feign this disorder, because it's her having complete control and it being this conscious process, when dissociation is a subconscious. It's not a conscious thing that a person has control over. So let's keep going.
I'm sorry, Taylor, Jasmine, Tisha, and Jasper? Okay. Did she ever mention Victoria?
No,
Did she ever mention Harmony?
no,
Did she ever mention Christina?
no,
Little Lucia?
no,
What about Maria Sanchez?
no.
So as she's saying these things to you, did you see any signs that she was changing personalities or turning into someone she's not?
No.
Based on what she's telling you, did you consider dissociative identity disorder as a diagnosis?
I considered it.
Tell the jury about that. What did you consider and what did you do to either diagnose her with it or rule it out or however you approach that?
Dissociative identity disorder is a very rare disorder. Somewhere between 0 and 1% of people have it. It's a very destructive, disabling disorder. People tend to be very high consumers of mental health services when they have DID. It can be very frightening because people don't know what's happening to them. They feel very strange and they can't explain what that is. So there's a lot of mental distress that goes along with that. And those people typically have very poor functioning, can't hold down jobs, can't hold down relationships, just not very productive.
And this is without treatment.
In talking with Ms. Stauch, she did not describe any such dysfunction. Her history didn't support that. And in describing the alters, which is what those different personalities are clinically referred to, she had selected names for them based on things she liked and aspirations she had, which is inconsistent with this disorder where typically the alters present themselves to you. You don't create them and you don't name them kind of whimsically. So I just didn't see any of the impairment that would be expected to go along with the claims that she was making.
If you wouldn't mind pulling that microphone a little closer to you.
Can you go to the
just
mic?
Make sure everyone can hear you.
Sorry, the chair is tilted in.
The microphone moves, the chair doesn't.
Okay, is that better?
Happen to everybody else, it's okay.
So can you expand on this disorder? What have you seen anyone with this disorder in your career?
I don't believe I've ever seen anyone with DID.
I have.
Based on, what do you base your opinions on then? Is it the DSM-5 and
Research.
research? Is this a type of disorder that would be hidden from relatives and family members?
I mean, with the expected dysfunction that I described, I don't know how somebody would be that impacted by a disorder and nobody would know something was wrong.
Exactly.
And is it based on what you've read and your experience, is it common for family members to actually seek help for someone who's having blackouts and not knowing what's happening and forget, things, significant things are happening in their lives, they're not able to function because of this type of stuff?
I would certainly expect that there would be some intervention sought.
See any of that with Ms. Stauch?
I wasn't provided any information to suggest that she had been a high consumer of mental health services or that anybody had concerns along those lines.
And just so we're clear, in a competency evaluation, does it end with a diagnosis of a mental disorder?
No, I'm not sure I know what you mean.
The more important.
Well, in your evaluations, or if you diagnose someone with, let's say, schizophrenia, is that the end of the evaluation? You say, oh, she's got, or she or he's got schizophrenia, we stop.
Okay, I understand. Sorry.
Okay.
No, absolutely not. So the profession of psychology considers mental illness, but the statute, the legal system considers mental disability. So I'm assessing for a mental disability.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference between those two is a mental illness is what you've heard of: depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. Within those disorders, everybody's going to experience them differently. So if two people are diagnosed with depression, you don't know what their experiences are or how impaired they are. A mental disability says, okay, they have a mental illness, but they're disabled by it. So it's to a high degree. It's not sufficient to have an illness. it has to be impacting functioning, and that in a specific way for competency, and that renders it a mental disability.
And is that the same for an insanity evaluation? Does it end with a mental illness diagnosis, or do you have to go further, similar to what you talked about in the
You have to
comments?
go
It's a slightly different definition, but yes, it's not sufficient to just have a mental illness.
And that's where I said a person can have a mental health diagnosis and still be found to have been in their right mind or to have not been criminally insane at the time of the offense. And that's the language that the court systems use.
I just want to talk about the vampires some more. Did you talk to Ms. Stauch about her experience with vampires during your forensic interview?
I did.
Tell the jury about that.
Ms. Stauch introduced a vampire called Justice. She said that there was a button in her cell that she could summon Justice, Jasper, perhaps Patrick, if I remember correctly. She said she had been introduced to vampires when she lived in Alaska previously. And they used to go door to door like Jehovah's Witnesses. And she didn't really offer them in any kind of meaningful way, like wasn't explaining anything or trying to use that information necessarily. But she certainly referenced them throughout the interview.
Did she tell you where she got these names for these so-called vampires she's talking about?
She directed me to the movie Twilight.
And did you find out that these names were from the movie Twilight or the book series involving Twilight?
Yeah, a few of them for sure. I'm not familiar with the series myself, but I Googled. She talked about a vampire council, and the name of the council was taken directly from that series. And then a couple of the names for sure came from there as well.
And is that something that would be common with someone who has dissociative identity disorder?
No.
That they would be able to tell you exactly where the names of other personalities came from and things like that?
Not from like.
Are you drawing a connection between the vampires and DID? Because I got a bit confused there.
No, I'll ask you a different question. What relevance, if any, did that have in your evaluation? The fact that she's talking about vampires that came from a movie.
Well, certainly if somebody's talking about vampires and that appears real to them, that could signify that they're experiencing a mental illness. So I looked further to see, I'm looking for consistency again. So it was notable that she said that she had been interfacing with these vampires since Alaska, but she made no mention of them to the previous evaluators. And she also didn't mention them throughout her jail stay until several months in. I think I lost track of your question. I'm sorry.
Well, what's the significance? It's one thing to say that I talk to vampires and I see vampires. What's the significance of her saying clarification? Well, these vampires came from a movie.
Right. So that's not consistent with a mental illness. It sounded like a fabrication. If people are talking to vampires, I would expect them to have their own unique aspects to them and something unique to the individual that would make sense in a greater scheme of how they see the world. And it just seemed like she was conveying a story essentially from fiction.
And did she bring this up on her own, or did you ask her questions that might trigger that answer?
I didn't ask her any questions about vampires initially.
And I forget the term you used to describe how she was talking to you, but she likes to talk, for lack of a better way to say it, right?
Yes.
Would she just volunteer information to you and change subjects as you're talking to her?
She didn't change subjects a whole lot. I didn't get the impression from her that she wasn't following my line of thought. She was telling a coherent story. She just gave far more information than was necessary to answer the question.
Okay. Did you perform any psychological testing with Ms. Stauch?
I administered 2 measures to assess for genuine responding for her mental illness symptoms.
And what were those measures?
The MFAST, which is a Miller Forensic Assessment of Symptoms test, and the SIRS-2, which is a structured interview of reported symptoms.
And what were the results of those psychological tests?
So she exceeded the cutoff on the MFAST. It's a screening measure for feigning. And feigning means the intentional exaggeration or production of mental illness symptoms. So she crossed over the threshold, indicating that she might in fact be feigning. but because it's a screening measure and it wasn't 100% sure, I gave another more comprehensive measure. On that measure, there's several scales. It looks at different aspects of feigning. Are you reporting symptoms that you're not manifesting observable behavior of? Are you reporting inconsistent symptoms, rare combinations of symptoms? So she just elevated one scale on that test, suggesting probable feigning. But on the test overall, it was indeterminate.
In your report, it indicates that she yielded a total score of 12. Do you remember what test that was on?
That was on the MFAST.
I'm going to skip
And
ahead.
what does that mean to you? What does the term malingering mean?
Malingering, excuse me, I'm sorry. Malingering is like feigning, where you're intentionally exaggerating your symptoms, but with malingering, there's an added element of the presumption of trying to obtain a secondary gain.
Did you see that in this case?
It certainly seemed that Ms. Stauch was presenting symptoms that she didn't appear to have. I can never know if somebody is trying to achieve a goal or not. So I didn't offer an opinion on malingering, but certainly there were suggestions that she was not as impaired as she was portraying.
Did you diagnose Ms. Stauch with anything or any mental disorder out of the DSM-5 as a result of your competency evaluation?
My diagnostic impressions were that she had some personality dysfunction, both with traits of borderline personality and narcissistic personality, but not meeting threshold for either full disorder. And I offered a rule out of PTSD versus an unspecified anxiety disorder. I just didn't have enough information. And given that it wasn't a clinical information and I wasn't there to help her, I didn't want to probe too much into her trauma.
Did that have any impact on your ultimate conclusion with regard to competency, either of these diagnoses?
Well, those diagnoses would not really reach the threshold of a mental disability.
For competency.
Is that why you didn't go further and try to rule out post-traumatic stress?
Whether or not she had post-traumatic stress, she did not demonstrate functional impairment as it related to competency. So for my purposes, it wasn't important.
Okay. So what does it mean when you say other specified personality disorder with borderline and narcissistic features? Can you break that down for the jury?
So personality disorders, just like other clinical disorders, have certain criteria that need to be met. And you have to have so many. I believe there might be 7, and you have to have 5 of 7 for each one. So in my impressions of her, she had a couple of features of borderline personality disorder. She was impulsive. She had some kind of push-pull relationships. You know, I don't know what Dr. Moore testified to yesterday, but there was insisting that she saw Dr. Moore, and then Dr. Moore would show up and she'd refuse to see her. That's quite consistent with a borderline personality. And the same for narcissistic personality. Those features are typically a sense of entitlement, grandiosity, a lack of empathy are 3 big ones. Ms. Stauch told me on 2 occasions during the interview that she lacked empathy and she didn't experience people's thoughts and feelings. She had grandiosity throughout our meeting where she, grandiosity. Thank you. Throughout our meeting where she touted her accomplishments, her intellect. She was refusing to meet with people that didn't have the highest credentials. She didn't want to meet with social workers. She wanted to meet with people with higher degrees in order to talk about her problems. Wasn't sure that she met all the criteria for the disorder. So I was just trying to convey my goal in an evaluation is to try to help the person reading it experience what I experienced meeting with her. And her personality was very much at the forefront of our interactions. So that's what I was trying to convey.
Did she ever refer to you as being an actress?
She made a comment. She said, "I think you're an actor." And then she just continued talking to me like she didn't really have the concern.
Was that about the time you were introducing yourself and saying what your role was, or at what point did that come up?
No, it was somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
And the personality traits coming up. So it was very difficult for me to listen and watch the recorded tapes of her, because the personality features were just very clear to me, having watched and having an understanding of the DSM, and just that lack of empathy and that over concern for herself and her needs, and just all of that. To me, that's what stood out the most. And I'm going to skip forward to the second expert's testimony. The defense attorneys are doing a good job on cross, and if y'all have questions about that, let me know, but I'm going to skip that and get to the next expert. So the second expert is Dr. Loandra Rouse, I think. I'm bad with names, but I know it's Dr. Loandra, and we are going to dive into her testimony. She is also a board certified forensic psychologist, and they went into, it is difficult to get board certified. It's a long process. It's expensive. It requires a lot. And these two individuals, they have went through that process. I felt their court testimony, I think they've done a lot more testifying than the witness from the day before, Dr. Moore, and because she seemed more nervous and a little bit more anxious during her testimony, which I totally get, because I have had to testify not in a criminal case, but in some custody and some other types of cases. And let's hear what she has to say. So she did the initial competency eval and then also the insanity evaluation as well.
Cases such as this one, we like to involve two individuals because it's two sets of eyes. Two individuals who can draw an opinion from what we see, what we are reading.
That's really smart.
And that's the primary reason.
And who is Dr. Gray?
Dr. Gray is currently employed as the clinical.
So Dr. Gray was the other person that did some of the evaluation, and they gave their opinion together. Let's keep going.
In organizing the yearly or bi-yearly trainings that we have as a department, which revolve around a number of different topics.
They do an evaluation in either the competency or the insanity evaluation?
No.
Was that simply a court order? It went to the state hospital. There's a process where people are assigned to do the evaluation and then it's done.
Yes.
Okay. However, you did indicate that you contacted both parties initially to see what concerns there may be or what issues there might be for you to look for. Is that what you testified to?
Yes, we did that for the competency evaluation as well as for the sanity evaluation.
And as you do these evaluations for court order, is there any incentive to go one way or the other in your conclusions?
No, we're paid the same regardless.
I hope you understand why I'm asking that. I'm not trying to offend you or anything, but do you just look at the discovery, the police reports, everything involved?
I'm going to skip ahead a little bit again.
And is that information that you and Dr. Gray used at least during the competency portion of this evaluation?
Yes.
For instance, was bipolar disorder a diagnosis that you were looking at as you were conducting this evaluation?
It was one of them.
And we're going to get to those in a little bit about the diagnosis. Why are you looking at diagnosis during a competency?
We consider a diagnosis because for competency, the legal definition is a mental or developmental disability, which essentially means if there is a mental illness that is impacting her, say, functional competency related abilities, which means whether she understands factual information pertaining to how court works, or whether she has a rational understanding of her case and can think through possible defenses in a rational manner.
And did you find that she could in this evaluation? Did you find her competent to proceed in the court proceedings?
Yes, ultimately we found her competent to proceed.
Now, again, the jury knows this, but I want to ask you, are you the first one doing a competency evaluation in this particular case?
Yes.
Are you familiar with Dr. Grimmett, who did the second competency evaluation?
Yes, I am.
You probably saw her out in the hallway earlier.
I did.
That's why I say the jury already knows about these things. So what I would like to do is talk about your forensic interview with the defendant, Ms. Stauch, on this June competency evaluation.
Okay.
So you meet with her in August of 2020, is that correct?
Yes.
What did she have to tell you about her personal background? Do you recall?
I mean, she said a number of things in terms of her personal background. She told us how she was born in North Carolina.
They're going to go into some
She
things. I'm going to skip this part.
described.
Because once again, this testimony is very similar to some of the other things that we've gone through already.
During the competency evaluation, I don't recall specifically, but I do know that she talked a lot about being manic. She talked about slipping in and out of reality.
Is that consistent with bipolar disorder being manic?
Mania is a component of bipolar disorder. And just because somebody says that they're manic doesn't necessarily mean that they are or have been or have bipolar disorder.
Did she ever bring up anything about having another personality or multiple personalities during your competency interview with her?
She did not.
Did you ask anything about that?
During the competency evaluation, we weren't specifically looking for a dissociative identity disorder.
She said dissociative.
But interestingly enough, when we were reviewing her responses on the PAI, the first test that we gave that had been
This
invalid,
is important.
one of the questions we asked her specifically about talked about having 3 or 4 personalities, and she had responded true to that item. So we asked her about that, and she essentially told us that sometimes she experiences different aspects of herself. So for example,
normal.
sometimes she feels more compassionate, or sometimes she feels more competitive when she's playing sports, or sometimes she lacks empathy when she's around her family, but she did not talk about or specifically delineate having different personalities in the way that she did during our sanity evaluation.
And was that of note to you? Because I know the big picture is coming on the insanity evaluation, but the first contact with her, you asked her directly about dissociative identity disorder or multiple personalities, and she denied that at that point?
Yeah, she definitely didn't endorse it in terms of the criteria for dissociative identity disorder and how they're written. So her response to us was pretty benign. We didn't think very much of it.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine it became, what's the opposite of benign?
Important.
It became important when she did disclose that she had dissociative identity disorder during the insanity portion.
Yes.
And we'll talk about that when we get there as well a little bit more, okay?
Gonna skip ahead again.
Needless to say, did you make some diagnosis of Ms. Stauch based on what you knew during the competency evaluation?
Yes.
And what diagnosis did you reach for Ms. Stauch?
We ultimately diagnosed her with a personality disorder, specifically a specified personality disorder, noting borderline and narcissistic features.
Tell the jury about that. What does that mean?
Sure. A personality disorder is essentially maladaptive personality characteristics that are evident throughout the lifespan. We noted borderline and narcissistic features given her history of instability of relationships, her history of mood swings that were, I want to say, best delineated by her public defender at that time. When we consulted with the public defender, she was the one who described an intense reactivity of emotion to different things, that just somebody who goes from 0 to 100 very quickly. We also noted her own self-report of impulsivity. Those were the primary features of a borderline personality that we noted with her. In terms of narcissistic features, she really touted her intelligence and her abilities. And when she spoke to us about her treatment in the jail, her expectations as it pertained to how she would not proceed with her defense, but how attorneys should treat her, there was some notable entitlement in that that gave us a hint that there might be some narcissistic features in there as well.
And the jury's heard about rule out, but did you have any rule out diagnosis with Ms. Stauch?
We did.
Can you just explain again? And the second aspect of it, forming the culpable mental state or having the capacity to do that, is it really the nature of the killing that kind of dictates their actions, determine whether or not they had the capacity to form that intent?
Yeah, when it comes to the capacity associated with the specific mental state, as evaluators, we take a look at the statutory language associated with each of the crimes to see what is the mental state that we're looking at. And we look at those definitions, with intent, specifically discusses whether they have a conscious objective in mind. Knowingly is more of whether they have an awareness that their actions are going to cause a behavior or that their actions are going to cause a result. Recklessly is whether they are consciously not paying attention to the fact that their actions could cause a result. So we take a look at those definitions and we think through that cognitively in terms of what were they demonstrating at the time of the offense, even in their own self-report. What are they saying that they were thinking? What are they saying about their own behavior? And we're really looking at whether or not they have the capacity to make judgments, reasons to think things through.
Is the type of weapon that may be used, does that come into consideration when you're making that type of evaluation?
I don't know that it does.
It can be. I would say it's not often a central focus of the evaluation.
Let's jump into your insanity evaluation of Ms. Stauch. Okay, let me see how we're doing on, Judge, we're doing okay on time. All right.
Yeah.
We now are in February of 2022.
They are going to show some videos.
Defendant pled not guilty by reason of insanity.
So now they're going to get into a few videos. Like I said, those videos are difficult to watch, and they're basically going to, I will play the one where she talks about the different personalities. Just because I made that note that the way that she does this, it's exactly the way I would think somebody with some narcissistic features would. It's not the way that I've seen dissociative identity disorder present in real life. So let's watch that.
And I was always scared of this in softball too, so that was like my outlet. Sure.
But you created her.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a personality, so did you create anyone else?
When, remember I told you I lived in a trailer? That was in 1996. That was during the Olympics, the U.S. women's gymnastics team that won a gold medal. And that, I played another personality doing that. That's Christina Brigana, and she's friends with like Carrie Strug, Dominic Dawes,
These
and a
sound more
bunch
like
of people that are on the
fantasies.
team. And like I had the whole
Endangered.
trailer to myself, so she would like be able to like create apparatuses and like do like balance beams off stuff, like because maybe days my mom would be gone, and so that was just the way I would cope with. No, and not knowing if my mom was ever going to take us back there, because I knew she would. Every time she said she was never going back, we'd go back. Because that helped me deal that year because I did stay really good in school, you know what I mean? Because my plan was like to get out one day, you know, and do really good, which I did end up doing really good in school. You know, I have a doctorate degree, but like,
Going into
if it wasn't
doctorate.
for being able to use it different, I guess you could probably like persona or whatever. I
Which
wouldn't
does
have
show
been able to
resilience. I do think she did have some trauma. Does not excuse, it helps me understand.
We have Harmony. Christina was the other one.
That was from when I was little. As I got older, there was more. There's Letecia, and there's Taylor, and there's Maria. She's protector. They like I don't. Sometimes like if you look at like a lot of my different social medias, they have different names.
And having different names on social media does not mean that those are different personalities, or having, you know, a particular name in somebody's phone. That does not mean that those are distinct personalities.
Different phrase, different one word. You could always tell if you're going to play softball because, like, if I was in Letecia, like Letecia, that man be dead serious, so I could get left-handed, left-handed, and like sometimes people wouldn't understand when I go to the plate, and they'd be like, "Hey, you need to hit left-handed, and you need to like," because there'd be like a runner, if you know, like baseball. There's like a runner in second and third. They're like, "You need to hit left-handed," but if I wasn't that personality, I couldn't hit left-handed.
And this is that incongruent affect again, where the thing she's saying doesn't match the emotion that she's showing. She looks happy.
We have, as you got older, there was Letecia. Taylor. You said Taylor was the protector.
Yeah, Taylor's my main person. No, Maria's my protector. Taylor's my main personality.
Thank you. Maria.
Mm-hmm.
And Maria's the one.
Victoria is the only personality that I have like empathy in because I store so much of, you know, trauma. If you want me to like be like if a friend's talking to me and they need me to give them advice, I have to switch to Victoria to actually try and be empathetic at all. Like severely empathetic, you know what I mean?
And to me, she's describing more just kind of code switching, like more like just the different aspects of her personality, and not that these are separate identities with their own memories and all these things. My thoughts, my opinion.
All right. Taylor's the main personality. Maria's the protector. Victoria is the one who has the most empathy and kindness.
And then Letecia, she's bipolar. She would be doing the most. Like you'll notice when I'm on Letecia. Actually, the psychiatrist the other day came to take my meds. She was doing the most. She's bipolar tech, and she was up for 4, 5, 6 days at a time. You know.
And she's talking about herself because they're going to ask who she is right now. And I believe she's going to say that she's being Letecia right now. And she also says that she can't. So Maria is supposedly the one that did the crime, and they can't talk to Maria.
So I think it's Kepler or something like that.
They're currently on Kepler.
But I think Maria comes out in the defense attorney, in the defense one, because Maria has a different accent. And Maria also, she says Maria came out when they were in the van, and they're going to replay Letecia's attack in the van. And there was no accent because she says Maria's the one that did that. It wasn't her. And if it had been a different alter, it would have just been a very different situation from what I know and from what I've seen.
Kept Thompson. Yeah. Kept from. I was gonna go be back on the left perk so, but I'll be eating too much on it. I don't like it.
So who are we talking to right now?
Yeah. Okay.
Letecia. She was talking about herself in the.
When you say Taylor is the main personality, what do you mean by that?
It's like, okay, so you notice like where Letecia, she's like more like into her like thug life. I guess you can say like rap music, that kind of thing. But Taylor's everything is like Letecia all wanted to be because she gets to be like yeah, kind to everybody, but like successful. She has a whole separate world, you know.
It sounds like she's trying to say Taylor is kind of the one that also holds that some of the trauma memories, but also is what she wants to be. But it sounds like this good side, bad side, more like within borderline personality disorder and not at all consistent with dissociative identity disorder. That's my opinion from watching this.
Oh, she's married to Tyler. They have kids.
Taylor wanted to be in Letecia get married to Tyler.
No. Taylor is everything Letecia. Exactly. Yeah, Taylor is married to Tyler and have 3 kids, Ariana, Alicia, and Adriano.
And these sound like fantasies. This fantasy person that maybe she wanted to be
Okay,
married
we
to.
stopped it at 25:30.
It's just very strange. And so I talked about a little bit of what they got into later. With this court, it is interesting that the jury is able to ask questions, and some of the questions that have been coming forward with the jury, because I do remember one that was something like, can somebody go through significant trauma and not have significant mental health effects? Or like there were some clarification questions that the jury has been able to ask each witness. I haven't seen that, I don't believe, in any live trials that I've watched so far, but I'm going to watch the rest of her testimony when she comes back on Friday. If there are major things, I will do a video on that. I believe the prosecution is going to be wrapping up soon, and then the defense is going to start their case. I will definitely, whoever that mental health expert for the defense, I cannot wait to hear. And I remember Dr. Spiegel. Y'all remember Dr. Spiegel? So I would not accept a case because let's say the defense is like, we want somebody that's going to say this. And in meeting with her, I would not say that she has dissociative identity just because I don't see it. But they found somebody that supposedly saw it, and we will see where things go. If you have questions, let me know in the comments. And I'm going to put the video that I did explaining more about dissociative identity disorder and dissociation, along with different treatment recommendations for severe trauma. And I hope y'all enjoy the rest of your day.